In the winter of 1973, inside a secured financial analysis facility outside Washington, D.C., a government contractor received a strange internal memo. It was only 4 sentences long. The final sentence read, "Behavioral instability indicators are accelerating faster than projected public awareness." At the time, almost nobody questioned it, because the people inside the facility believed they were building an economic forecasting system, not a psychological one. Officially, the project did not exist. No public hearings, no press release, no congressional discussion, only scattered procurement records, fragmented contractor invoices, and a series of corrupted magnetic data reels discovered decades later inside a decommissioned archive facility. The project carried multiple internal names over the years, but in several surviving documents, analysts repeatedly referred to it as the Behavioral Forecasting Initiative. Its purpose sounded harmless at first: predict economic panic before it spread. Not after, before. Because during the late 1960s and early 1970s, institutional fear inside financial agencies was growing rapidly. Oil instability, currency pressure, Cold War uncertainty, supply chain disruption, public distrust. The concern was no longer whether markets could crash. The concern was whether human behavior itself had become mathematically unstable. And for the first time, institutions believed computers might be capable of detecting mass psychological shifts before humans could consciously recognize them. The system they built was primitive by modern standards, but the underlying idea was disturbingly modern. Feed massive behavioral inputs into predictive models. Identify emotional volatility patterns. Forecast panic contagion. Then intervene before the public realized what was happening. At least that was the theory. The facility itself was described in contractor records as an economic systems observatory. But former maintenance personnel described something far stranger. Rooms filled with continuously printing thermal paper. Massive reel-to-reel computer systems running overnight simulations. Analysts sleeping beside terminal stations. Walls covered in market fluctuation charts. Dozens of analog clocks tracking financial centers around the world. And one recurring phrase written across multiple erased whiteboard photographs: population response lag. The system wasn't just tracking markets. It was tracking people, consumer hesitation, television sentiment, regional anxiety spikes, commodity purchasing patterns, public language shifts inside newspaper interviews, behavioral reactions to fuel shortages, telephone complaint frequencies, withdrawal behavior in regional banks. The objective was simple: identify collective fear before it became visible. By 1974, internal reports suggest the system began generating increasingly accurate behavioral projections. One partially recovered document referenced pre-event emotional clustering. Another described financial rumor acceleration zones. But one analyst note buried inside a damaged archive folder was different. It contained only a single sentence: the machine identified the panic before the newspapers did. Nobody knows exactly how accurate the system became, because many operational records disappeared. Not classified, not destroyed officially, just missing. But several surviving procurement documents reveal something unusual happened in early 1975. The project received expanded computational funding immediately after a failed market stabilization attempt, which suggests one possibility: the forecasts may have been correct, and institutions may have ignored them. Former contractor interviews conducted decades later describe a growing internal divide inside the facility. Some analysts believed the system was becoming dangerously effective. Others argued the forecasts themselves could psychologically influence decision-makers. Because once institutions believe panic is coming, their behavior changes too. The prediction becomes part of the system. One archived discussion transcript referenced this exact concern. An executive reportedly warned, if behavioral forecasts alter institutional reactions, then the model becomes recursive. Recursive, meaning the system was no longer merely observing reality. It was beginning to shape it. This is where the archive becomes increasingly difficult to interpret, because during the late 1970s, references to direct market forecasting begin disappearing from surviving documents. Instead, new terminology appears: behavioral synchronization, attention mapping, narrative response velocity. The language starts sounding less like economics and more like population psychology. One recovered systems diagram appears to connect financial stress events with media exposure cycles. Another maps behavioral reactions geographically, not economic movement, emotional movement. The institution had realized something profoundly important. Human panic does not spread logically. It spreads socially, visually, emotionally. The researchers began studying how emotional responses traveled through communities, how uncertainty multiplied itself, how small behavioral irregularities became large social reactions. One document described panic as a contagious cognitive environment. Another referred to public confidence as a temporary stability construct. Inside the facility, the atmosphere reportedly changed. Engineers stopped referring to the project as a forecasting system. Instead, some began calling it an atmospheric model. Not because it predicted weather, because it attempted to predict emotional climate. The deeper the system evolved, the more data it demanded. Regional purchasing reports, telephone traffic spikes, broadcast media language analysis, behavioral irregularities inside consumer banking patterns, and eventually, psychological segmentation profiles. The goal was no longer simply predicting economic crashes. The goal was identifying the conditions that caused collective behavioral instability. Several surviving interviews suggest some analysts became deeply uncomfortable with the direction of the project, not because the system was inaccurate, but because it appeared to work too well. One former technician recalled an incident involving a projected fuel panic simulation. According to his statement, the system predicted severe regional purchasing behavior nearly 11 days before shortages became publicly visible. The forecast was initially dismissed. Then the panic happened almost exactly as modeled. Afterward, access restrictions inside the facility reportedly intensified. Entire sections of the building became compartmentalized. Magnetic archive tapes disappeared overnight. Security protocols changed. Analysts were reassigned without explanation. And certain simulation rooms could no longer be entered without dual authorization clearance. Nobody outside the project understood why. But internally, something had shifted. The institution no longer viewed the system as experimental. It viewed it as operational. That distinction changed everything. Because once a predictive system becomes operational, pressure begins to emerge. Pressure from agencies. Pressure from executives. Pressure from markets. Pressure to use forecasts not only to observe instability, but to manage it. And once management becomes possible, influence is never far behind. One archive fragment described behavioral stabilization opportunities. Another referenced narrative synchronization windows. The terminology becomes increasingly unsettling because it sounds familiar, not futuristic, current, modern. The archive never proves anyone attempted population manipulation, but it repeatedly reveals institutional fascination with predictive emotional modeling. And that fascination never disappeared. It evolved alongside technology. The computational systems of the 1970s were slow, isolated, and limited. Today's systems are not. Modern algorithms process behavioral signals continuously. Search patterns, scrolling velocity, attention duration, engagement persistence, reaction timing, emotional responsiveness. Financial systems now monitor sentiment shifts in real time. Advertising infrastructures optimize behavioral reinforcement automatically. Recommendation engines study human hesitation at massive scale. Not because modern systems are secretly controlling populations, because predicting human behavior became economically valuable. And once prediction becomes profitable, optimization inevitably follows. The difference is that today, these systems no longer exist inside isolated Cold War facilities. They exist inside phones, applications, streaming platforms, trading systems, recommendation feeds, and most of the time, The optimization feels convenient. Invisible systems rarely feel invasive when they improve comfort. That may be why the older archive matters, because it captures the exact historical moment institutions first recognized something deeply important. Human behavior leaves measurable patterns. Not perfect patterns, not absolute patterns, but predictive enough to influence surrounding systems. The engineers building those early models probably believed they were preventing instability, reducing panic, protecting institutional continuity, maintaining economic order. But systems designed to predict fear eventually learn how fear behaves. And systems that understand fear also learn how attention behaves. That distinction matters more than ever now, because modern behavioral infrastructures no longer compete only for money. They compete for human focus, reaction time, emotional persistence, psychological engagement. Entire industries now depend on predicting what people will feel before they consciously understand it themselves. Sometimes to sell products, sometimes to stabilize markets, sometimes simply to keep attention from drifting elsewhere. The archive never proves there was a conspiracy. It proves something far more realistic. Institutions discovered that collective behavior contains recognizable signals. And once signals become measurable, systems will always attempt to optimize around them. The final surviving document connected to the Behavioral Forecasting Initiative is heavily damaged. Water stains cover most of the page. The upper section appears burned. Entire paragraphs are unreadable, but one sentence remains visible near the bottom. Predictive stability depends on continuous behavioral input. No one knows who wrote it, or what exactly they meant. But decades later, the sentence feels less like a forgotten technical observation and more like an accidental description of the modern world. Because today, behavioral input never stops. Every click, every hesitation, every search, every reaction, every moment of attention feeds systems designed to learn what humans will do next. The original archive ends there. The behavioral pattern does not.